359 million years ago, Earth entered the Carboniferous Period, a time unlike anything we see today. Huge swamp forests stretched across the land, filling the air with rich oxygen that helped giant insects grow to astonishing sizes. Dragonflies with wings wider than many birds, massive millipedes and other strange creatures ruled the forests while the first reptiles began to appear. Thick layers of dead plants slowly turned into the coal that people still use today. Every fossil discovered has helped scientists understand more about this remarkable world, although many mysteries remain. The Carboniferous Period began about 359 million years ago and ended about 299 million years ago. It lasted for around 60 million years, making it one of the longer periods in Earth's geological history. It came after the Devonian period and before the Permian period. Each of these periods had its own unique forms of life and environmental conditions, but the Carboniferous period became especially well known because of its vast forests, rich plant life, high oxygen levels, and unusually large insects. The name Carboniferous comes from the word carbon. Scientists gave it this name because many of the world's coal deposits formed during this time. Thick forests covered large parts of the land. As plants lived, grew, died, and fell into wet, swampy ground, many of them did not completely rot away. Instead, layers of plant material built up over long stretches of time. Mud, sand, and other sediments buried these layers. Heat and pressure slowly changed the buried plant remains into coal over millions of years. Many countries still use coal that first began forming during the Carboniferous period. During this time, Earth had only one major landmass forming through the gradual joining of continents. Large continental blocks slowly moved closer together because of plate tectonics. This movement eventually led towards the formation of the supercontinent known as Pangaea. The continents did not move quickly. Their movement was extremely slow, taking millions of years. Even though the changes happened at a very slow pace, they had major effects on climate, mountain building, ocean currents, and the distribution of plants and animals. The position of the continents during the Carboniferous period was different from today. Much of the land near the equator had a warm and wet climate. These conditions allowed enormous forests to grow across wide lowland areas. Rivers spread across broad floodplains. Swamps covered many regions. The ground often stayed wet throughout the year, making it easier for thick layers of vegetation to build up. The climate varied from one place to another. Some areas remained warm and humid, while other regions experienced cooler conditions. During the later part of the Carboniferous period, large ice sheets developed across parts of the southern hemisphere. These glaciers expanded and retreated several times over millions of years. Changes in sea level followed these cycles because water became locked inside growing ice sheets and later returned to the oceans when the ice melted. Even though glaciers existed in some parts of the world, tropical forests continued to thrive near the equator. This shows that Earth supported very different climates at the same time. Warm swamp forests existed in one region, while icy landscapes covered another. The location of each continent influenced the climate it experienced. The atmosphere during the Carboniferous period also differed from today's atmosphere. One of the most important differences involved oxygen. Scientists believe that oxygen levels became much higher than they are now. Plants growing in huge forests produced large amounts of oxygen through photosynthesis. As plant material became buried before it could fully decay, large amounts of carbon stayed trapped underground. This process helped oxygen build up in the atmosphere over long periods. Higher oxygen levels affected many living organisms. Some animals were able to grow larger than similar species living today. This is especially noticeable among insects and other arthropods. Many of these creatures breathed through tiny tubes that carried oxygen into their bodies. Higher oxygen levels allowed this breathing system to work more effectively, making larger body sizes possible for some species. The Carboniferous forests were unlike modern forests in several ways. Many of the tallest plants were not flowering trees because flowering plants had not yet evolved. Instead, forests contained giant club mosses, towering horsetails, seed ferns, tree ferns, and other ancient plants. Some of these plants reached heights that would still appear impressive today. Their trunks often look different from modern trees because they belong to plant groups that are now either extinct or represented by much smaller relatives. The ground beneath these forests contained thick layers of fallen leaves, branches, spores, and plant debris. The damp conditions slowed the complete breakdown of this material. In many swampy places, water covered the ground for long periods. Oxygen inside the wet soil remained limited, reducing the activity of organisms that normally break down dead plants. As a result, organic material accumulated year after year. Rivers constantly changed the landscape. Some rivers slowly shifted their channels across the floodplains. Others flooded during wet seasons, spreading fresh layers of mud over nearby forests and swamps. These sediments buried plant remains, helping preserve them. Over millions of years, repeated flooding created alternating layers of sandstone, shale, limestone, and coal that geologists can still study today. The oceans also played an important role during the Carboniferous period. Marine life remained rich and varied. Coral communities, shellfish, crinoids, brachiopods, ammonoid relatives, sharks, and many kinds of fish filled the seas. Some shallow seas covered parts of the continents, creating habitats where many marine species lived and reproduced. Fish continued to diversify during this period. Some species possessed powerful jaws suited for hunting other animals. Others fed on smaller organisms or plant material. Sharks had already appeared before the Carboniferous period, and they continued developing into many different forms. Fossils show that ancient sharks occupied many marine environments and filled several ecological roles. Life on land experienced important changes as well. Earlier periods had already seen the first forests and the first vertebrate animals moving onto land. During the Carboniferous period, these early developments became much more widespread. Forests expanded across large areas, creating new habitats for many living creatures. Animals adapted to life among dense vegetation, wet soil, rivers, and swamps. Amphibians became especially successful during this time. Many species spent much of their lives near water because they still depended on moist environments for reproduction. Their eggs usually needed water to develop properly. Swamps, ponds, lakes, and slow-moving rivers provided suitable places for breeding. Different amphibian species occupied different habitats and developed a variety of body sizes and feeding habits. Another major development during the Carboniferous period involved the rise of early reptiles. These animals introduced an important change in reproduction. Unlike amphibians, reptiles produced eggs that could survive away from open water. Protective coverings around the eggs reduced water loss and protected the developing young. This allowed reptiles to spread into habitats that were less dependent on permanent water sources. The appearance of these early reptiles represented an important step in vertebrate evolution. Over millions of years, reptiles diversified into many groups. Much later, some reptile groups eventually gave rise to dinosaurs, birds, and mammals through separate evolutionary pathways. Although those developments happened long after the Carboniferous period, the early stages began during this remarkable time. Insects flourished throughout the Carboniferous forests. Some dragonfly relatives developed wingspans much larger than those of any living dragonfly. Giant millipedes crawled across the forest floor. Large relatives of modern cockroaches became common. Many insects relied on the rich plant life for food or shelter, while others hunted smaller animals. The abundance of plants supported complex food chains. Plant-eating animals fed on leaves, stems, spores, and other plant parts. Predators hunted insects, amphibians, and smaller vertebrates. Decomposers helped recycle nutrients wherever conditions allowed dead material to break down. Every part of the ecosystem contributed to maintaining the balance of life. Fungi also played an important role in Carboniferous ecosystems. They helped break down wood and other plant material. Scientists continue studying ancient fungi because they may help explain why so much plant material accumulated during this period instead of fully decomposing. Different fungal groups evolved over time, gradually becoming more effective at digesting certain plant tissues. Microorganisms, although rarely seen in fossils, influenced the environment in many ways. Bacteria participated in nutrient cycling, soil formation, and decomposition. Tiny organisms living in freshwater and marine environments supported food webs by providing food for larger animals. Even though these microscopic forms of life rarely attract attention, they formed the foundation of many ecosystems. The Carboniferous period also witnessed active geological processes. Volcanoes erupted in various regions. Earthquakes occurred as tectonic plates continued moving. Mountains slowly rose where continental masses collided. Weathering and erosion wore down older rocks, while rivers carried sediments into lowlands and shallow seas. Mountain building influenced rainfall patterns. High land blocked moisture from reaching some regions while increasing rainfall in others. These changes affected where forests expanded and where drier environments developed. Over millions of years, landscapes continued changing through the combined effects of tectonic activity, erosion, sediment deposition, and changing sea levels. Coal formation remained one of the defining features of the Carboniferous period. Thick peat layers formed inside swamps where dead plants accumulated faster than they decayed. As sediments buried the peat, increasing pressure squeezed out water. Heat from deeper burials slowly transformed the material into different grades of coal. This process required millions of years and continued long after the Carboniferous forests disappeared. Modern industries have relied heavily on Carboniferous coal deposits, coal-powered factories, trains, ships, and power stations during many stages of human history. Even today, some countries continue using coal that originated from forests growing hundreds of millions of years ago. This direct connection between ancient ecosystems and modern civilization highlights the lasting importance of the Carboniferous period. Scientists study Carboniferous rocks found on nearly every continent. Fossils preserved inside these rocks reveal details about ancient plants, animals, climates, and environments. Paleontologists examine bones, leaves, spores, footprints, burrows, and fossilized wood to understand how organisms lived. Geologists analyze rock layers to reconstruct ancient rivers, coastlines, mountains, and oceans. Modern technology has improved our understanding of this period. Microscopes allow researchers to study fossil spores and pollen. Chemical analyses reveal information about ancient climates. computer models help scientists reconstruct continental positions and environmental conditions. Imaging techniques provide detailed views of fossil structures without damaging valuable specimens. Scientists do not know every detail about the Carboniferous period. New fossil discoveries continue changing scientific understanding. Some interpretations are revised as additional evidence becomes available. This ongoing research helps create a more complete picture of Earth's distant past. One interesting feature of Carboniferous plant life involved reproduction through spores. Many dominant plants released enormous numbers of microscopic spores into the air. Wind carried these spores across forests and wetlands. If they landed in suitable environments with enough moisture, they could develop into new plants. Seed-producing plants also became increasingly common during this period, providing another successful reproductive strategy. The spread of forests influenced Earth's atmosphere. Large amounts of carbon became locked inside growing trees and buried plant material. This affected the balance of gases in the atmosphere over long periods. Scientists study these ancient processes because they provide insights into the long-term carbon cycle that continues operating today. The Carboniferous landscape supported a wide variety of habitats. Dense forests occupied many lowlands. Open floodplains stretched beside rivers. Freshwater lakes supported aquatic life. Marshes and swamps remained filled with vegetation. Coastal regions bordered shallow seas. Upland areas developed different plant communities, depending on elevation and rainfall. Each habitat supported different groups of organisms. Some animals spent nearly all their lives in water. Others lived among tree trunks or climbed through branches. Many insects depended on moist environments, while early reptiles gradually expanded into areas farther from water. These differences reduced competition by allowing species to occupy different ecological roles. Predation shaped animal evolution throughout the Carboniferous period. Hunting animals developed improved senses, stronger jaws, sharper teeth, and faster movement. Potential prey evolved defensive adaptations such as protective body coverings, camouflage, burrowing behavior, or rapid escape responses. These continuing interactions influenced the evolution of many groups. Reproduction remained closely connected to environmental conditions. Amphibians required water for breeding. Plants released spores during suitable seasons. Early reptiles laid protected eggs on land. Insects developed life cycles that matched the availability of food and favorable weather. These reproductive strategies increased the chances that offspring would survive. Seasonal changes affected many Carboniferous ecosystems. Rainfall varied during different times of the year in some regions. Rivers rose and fell. Flooding sometimes buried forests beneath sediment. Drier periods influenced plant growth and water availability. Organisms adapted their behavior and life cycles to these changing conditions. Although the Carboniferous period is often remembered for giant insects, these remarkable animals represented only one part of a much larger and more diverse world. Forests contained countless plant species. Rivers supported many aquatic animals. Swamps provided breeding grounds for amphibians. Oceans remained filled with fish and marine invertebrates. Every environment contributed to the rich diversity of life. The fossil record from the Carboniferous period remains one of the most informative records available for understanding early terrestrial ecosystems. Coal mines have uncovered fossil forests with upright tree trunks preserved where they originally grew. Some sites contain footprints left by amphibians and reptiles walking across soft mud. Fossil leaves reveal ancient plant diversity. Spores preserved inside rock layers help scientists identify vegetation that once covered different regions. Evidence from ancient soils provides additional information. Fossil soils preserve root systems, mineral changes, and traces of ancient organisms. These features help scientists reconstruct rainfall patterns, drainage conditions, and vegetation types. Together with fossils and rock layers, ancient soils create a detailed picture of Carboniferous environments. The Carboniferous period occupies an important place in Earth's history because many biological and geological developments occurred together. Expanding forests transformed landscapes. Atmospheric oxygen reached unusually high levels. Coal deposits accumulated beneath swamps. Early reptiles established new reproductive strategies. Amphibians diversified across freshwater habitats. Insects reached remarkable sizes. Continents continued moving toward a new arrangement that would eventually shape future climates and ecosystems. The Earth's surface has never been fixed. The outer layer of the planet is broken into large pieces called tectonic plates. These plates move very slowly over millions of years. Even though the movement is extremely slow, the passing of millions of years allows continents to travel across great distances. During the Carboniferous period, these slow movements continued to reshape the planet. Continents collided with one another, some areas rose into mountains, and new coastlines formed as the shape of the land changed. One of the largest landmasses during the Carboniferous was Gondwana. This enormous southern continent included land that later became Africa, South America, Antarctica, Australia, the Indian subcontinent, and parts of the Arabian Peninsula. Gondwana covered a vast area of the southern hemisphere. It stretched across many climate zones from warmer regions closer to the equator to colder regions near the South Pole. Another major landmass was Laurussia, which is sometimes called Euramerica. This continent included much of what later became North America, Greenland, parts of Europe, and nearby regions. Laurussia was located close to the equator during much of the Carboniferous. This position placed large parts of the continent in warm and wet conditions that supported thick forests filled with giant plants. As time passed during the Carboniferous, Gondwana and Laurussia slowly moved toward one another. The movement was not sudden. It happened over millions of years as tectonic plates continued their slow journey. The space between these continents gradually became smaller. This movement was part of the long process that eventually formed the supercontinent known as Pangaea. Pangaea was one of the largest landmasses that ever existed. Its formation did not happen all at once. The Carboniferous was one of the important stages in this long process. During this time, several continents came closer together, while mountain-building events took place where landmasses collided. These changes affected rivers, coastlines, climates, and the spread of living things across the Earth. Large oceans surrounded these continents. One of the greatest oceans during the Carboniferous was Panthalassa. This enormous ocean covered much of the Earth's surface. It stretched around the growing continents and contained many different marine environments. Countless kinds of sea life lived within its waters, including fish, shellfish, corals, and many other organisms that filled the oceans. Another important body of water was the Paleotethys Ocean. This ocean lay between Gondwana and the northern continents. It served as an important marine region where many sea creatures lived and spread. As continents slowly shifted, the size and shape of this ocean also changed. Many parts of the continents were covered by shallow inland seas. These were not deep oceans. Instead, they were broad areas where seawater spread across low-lying land. The water was often warm because many of these regions lay close to the equator. Sunlight reached the sea floor in many places, allowing many kinds of marine plants and animals to thrive. Shallow seas played a major role in the Carboniferous world. They created rich habitats filled with life. Many shellfish, corals, crinoids, brachiopods, bryozoans, ammonoids and fish lived in these waters. Their remains later became part of sedimentary rocks that scientists study today to understand ancient marine ecosystems. The coastlines during the Carboniferous were very different from modern coastlines. Since sea levels changed many times, shorelines often moved inland or retreated toward the sea. Areas that were once dry land could later become flooded, while places covered by water could eventually become land again. These repeated changes shaped many landscapes over millions of years. Sea level changes happened for several reasons. One important reason involved the growth and melting of large ice sheets. When more water became locked inside glaciers, sea levels dropped. When glaciers melted, sea levels rose again. These changes affected where forests could grow and where marine animals could live. The southern part of Gondwana experienced major glaciation during parts of the Carboniferous. Large ice sheets formed across regions that later became parts of Antarctica, southern Africa, South America, and Australia. The climate in these southern areas became much colder than in equatorial regions. Evidence for these ancient glaciers can still be found today. Scientists have discovered scratches on rocks, deposits left behind by moving ice, and large boulders carried far from their original locations. These signs help show that glaciers once covered wide parts of Gondwana during the Carboniferous. While southern Gondwana experienced cold conditions, regions near the equator were much warmer. These equatorial lands received abundant rainfall throughout much of the year. The warm temperatures and steady supply of water allowed dense forests to spread across enormous areas. These forests became some of the richest plant environments in Earth's history. Giant club mosses, horsetails, seed ferns and tree ferns filled wetlands that stretched across low-lying plains. Thick vegetation covered the ground, creating habitats for insects, amphibians, spiders, millipedes, and many other forms of life. The warm climate near the equator did not remain exactly the same throughout the entire Carboniferous. There were periods of wetter conditions and periods that became somewhat drier. These changes affected which plants became most common in different regions. Forests expanded during wetter times and became smaller in places where rainfall decreased. Rainfall played an essential role in maintaining Carboniferous forests. Rivers overflowed into floodplains, wetlands stayed waterlogged, and dead plant material often remained underwater. Because the plant remains did not fully decay, thick layers of organic matter slowly built up over long periods. These thick layers eventually became peat. As more sediments buried the peat over millions of years, heat and pressure slowly changed it into coal. Many of the coal deposits mined around the world today began forming during the Carboniferous because these swamp forests covered such large areas. The location of the continents near the equator helped support these forests. Strong sunlight reached these regions throughout the year. Warm temperatures encouraged plant growth, while frequent rainfall supplied the water needed by the forests. Together, these conditions allowed plants to grow rapidly and continuously. The Carboniferous atmosphere also differed from today's atmosphere. Oxygen levels became much higher than modern levels during parts of the period. Scientists believe this increase happened because enormous forests produced large amounts of oxygen through photosynthesis, while huge quantities of plant material became buried before completely breaking down. The increase in oxygen affected many forms of life. large insects became possible because insects breathe through small openings connected to tubes inside their bodies. Higher oxygen levels allowed oxygen to move more effectively through these systems, supporting larger body sizes in some insect groups. The climate varied across different parts of the world. Equatorial regions stayed warm and humid for much of the Carboniferous. Areas farther from the equator experienced changing seasons and different amounts of rainfall. The southernmost parts of Gondwana became cold enough to support extensive glaciers. Mountains also influenced local climates. As moist air moved toward mountain ranges, rainfall often increased on one side, while drier conditions developed on the opposite side. These differences created varied habitats even within the same continent. Mountain building became an important feature of the Carboniferous world. When continents collided, enormous forces pushed rocks upward. Some mountain ranges that exist today began forming during these ancient collisions. Although erosion has changed their appearance over millions of years, their origins can often be traced back to the Carboniferous. One important mountain building event affected parts of present-day Europe. Another influenced eastern North America. These geological events occurred as continental plates slowly pressed against one another. Layers of rock folded, cracked, and rose upward over very long periods. The formation of mountains also changed river systems. Rivers adjusted their paths as higher land developed. Some valleys became deeper, while new floodplains formed in other areas. Sediments carried by rivers spread across lowlands, helping create fertile environments where plants flourished. River networks covered many Carboniferous landscapes. Some rivers flowed slowly across broad plains, while others moved more quickly through valleys. Seasonal flooding deposited mud, sand, and organic material onto surrounding land. These sediments helped preserve many fossils that scientists study today. Delta regions developed where rivers entered shallow seas. These areas became rich ecosystems containing freshwater and marine organisms. Plants grew along riverbanks while fish moved between rivers and coastal waters. Many amphibians also depended on these environments for breeding and feeding. The Carboniferous coastline included marshes, lagoons, estuaries, sandy beaches, and muddy shorelines. Each environment supported different forms of life. Some organisms preferred freshwater habitats, while others thrived in salty coastal waters. Many freshwater lakes also existed during the Carboniferous. Some formed naturally within low-lying basins, while others developed as rivers changed course. These lakes supported fish, amphibians, aquatic plants, and countless small organisms. Volcanic activity continued in some parts of the world. Volcanoes released lava, ash, and gases into the atmosphere. New volcanic rocks formed as molten material cooled. Although volcanic activity affected certain regions, much of the Carboniferous landscape remained dominated by forests, rivers, wetlands, and shallow seas. The movement of tectonic plates sometimes caused earthquakes. These natural events reshaped landscapes by creating faults, lifting land, or causing parts of the ground to sink. Over millions of years, repeated geological activity gradually altered the map of the Earth. Different climates influenced the spread of plants. Wet tropical forests dominated equatorial regions, while other plant communities occupied areas with less rainfall. Plants adapted to local conditions, allowing different ecosystems to develop across the continents. The distribution of animals also depended on geography. Since continents were arranged differently than today, many species spread across connected land areas that later became separated. Fossils discovered on different modern continents often show that these regions were once joined together. Marine life spread through connected seas and oceans. Fish, sharks, corals, mollusks, echinoderms, and many other organisms occupied shallow coastal waters as well as deeper marine environments. Ocean currents helped distribute nutrients and influenced where different species lived. Ocean currents also affected climate. Warm water moving through tropical regions carried heat across large areas, while colder currents influenced temperatures elsewhere. These patterns affected rainfall, storms, and seasonal weather over long periods. Wind patterns developed as air moved between warm and cold regions. Warm air near the equator rose into the atmosphere, while cooler air moved toward lower latitudes. These large-scale movements helped distribute heat and moisture around the planet. The Carboniferous atmosphere contained abundant moisture in tropical regions. Frequent rainfall fed rivers and wetlands, keeping forests healthy. Water evaporated from seas, lakes, and rivers before returning as rain, maintaining the water cycle across these landscapes. The soils of Carboniferous forests were often wet and rich in decaying plant material. Fallen leaves, branches, trunks, and roots accumulated on the forest floor. Many microorganisms, fungi, and small animals helped break down this material, although decomposition often remained incomplete in waterlogged swamps. Low-lying land was especially common near the equator. These broad plains became ideal locations for swamp forests because water drained slowly. Constant moisture allowed plants to thrive for long periods without drying out. The shape of the continents influenced rainfall patterns. Coastal regions often received abundant moisture from nearby seas, while inland areas sometimes became drier depending on mountain barriers and prevailing winds. The Carboniferous world supported a remarkable variety of habitats within relatively short distances. Swamps could exist beside rivers, forests could spread across floodplains, and shallow seas could lie only a short distance from dense vegetation. This close arrangement of environments allowed many species to interact with one another. Plant life dominated much of the landscape. Club mosses reached impressive heights. Giant horsetails formed thick stands along wet ground. Tree ferns spread their leaves above the forest floor, while seed ferns occupied many areas alongside other plants. These forests produced vast amounts of organic matter year after year. Many insects depended on these forests. They fed on plants, decaying material, fungi, or other animals. Some flew through the forest canopy, while others lived among fallen leaves or inside rotting wood. Warm temperatures supported active insect populations throughout much of the year. Amphibians became important members of Carboniferous ecosystems. Many species depended on rivers, ponds, marshes, and wetlands for reproduction. Their eggs usually required water, making moist habitats essential for their survival. Early reptiles also appeared during the Carboniferous. Some evolved eggs with protective coverings that allowed reproduction away from water. This adaptation gradually allowed reptiles to spread into habitats less dependent on wetlands. The arrangement of continents influenced the movement of animals. Connected land allowed species to spread across wide areas without crossing large oceans. As continents later separated, populations became isolated and gradually followed different evolutionary paths. Many fossils discovered today provide clues about the Carboniferous world map. Similar fossil plants have been found on continents now separated by vast oceans. Fossils of certain animals also appear across regions that were once connected. These discoveries support the understanding that Earth's continents have moved over geological time. Rock layers also preserve evidence of ancient environments. Coal indicates former swamp forests. Limestone often records ancient shallow seas rich in marine life. Sandstone may represent river channels, beaches, or deserts depending on its characteristics. shale commonly forms from fine mud deposited in quiet water. Scientists carefully examine these rock layers to reconstruct ancient geography. They study fossils, minerals, sediment patterns, and chemical signals preserved within rocks. Together, these clues help create detailed maps showing the position of continents, coastlines, mountains, rivers, and seas during the Carboniferous. The Earth's magnetic field also provides important evidence. When volcanic rocks cooled, tiny magnetic minerals aligned with the planet's magnetic field at that time. By measuring these preserved directions, scientists can estimate where continents were located millions of years ago. Modern satellite technology has helped improve understanding of ancient geography by allowing detailed mapping of rock formations across continents. Combined with field studies, drilling projects, fossil discoveries, and laboratory analysis, these methods continue to refine knowledge about the Carboniferous world. The Carboniferous climate was not completely stable throughout the entire period. Long-term changes occurred as continents shifted, mountain ranges grew, glaciers expanded or retreated, and sea levels rose or fell. These gradual changes influenced ecosystems across the planet. Some regions experienced repeated flooding from nearby seas. Each flooding event left marine sediments across the landscape. Later, rivers or forests covered the same area before another rise in sea level occurred. This repeated cycle created alternating layers of marine and land deposits preserved within the rocks. The interaction between land, sea, and climate shaped nearly every aspect of Carboniferous life. The location of continents controlled ocean circulation. Ocean circulation influenced climate. Climate affected rainfall and plant growth. Plant growth influenced atmospheric oxygen and the formation of coal deposits. These connected natural processes continued throughout the period as the Earth slowly changed. Different regions experienced unique local conditions despite belonging to the same global climate system. Coastal wetlands remained constantly moist. Upland regions experienced different temperatures, and glaciated southern lands supported very different environments from the tropical forests near the equator. As Gondwana continued moving northward and Laurussia shifted into position, the distance between major landmasses continued to decrease. These slow movements gradually reduced some ocean basins, while increasing mountain building activity, where continental edges met. The developing shape of the world influenced weather patterns across vast distances. Large landmasses affected how air moved, where storms formed, and how rainfall spread over different regions. Oceans also stored and released heat, helping shape long-term climate conditions. Carboniferous rivers carried enormous amounts of sediment from mountains into lower lands. Over countless years, these sediments built thick deposits across floodplains and deltas. Many fossil plants, insects, fish, amphibians, and other organisms became buried within these layers, preserving valuable evidence for future scientific study. The seas remained rich with marine life throughout much of the Carboniferous. Coral communities, shellfish, fish, sharks, crinoids, and many other organisms occupied different marine habitats depending on water depth, temperature, sunlight, and available nutrients. Some species preferred quiet lagoons, while others lived along reefs or open coastlines. Ice sheets across southern Gondwana expanded and retreated at different times during the Carboniferous. Each advance and retreat influenced global sea levels. When ice expanded, more water remained frozen on land, causing sea levels to fall. When ice melted, seawater spread farther across continental margins. These repeated changes influenced both marine and land ecosystems. Forests sometimes spread across newly exposed land. while later flooding covered parts of these forests with sediments. Such cycles helped create many of the rock formations preserved today. The Earth had already gone through many changes before these swamp forests appeared. Earlier periods had seen the gradual spread of plants from the edges of rivers and lakes onto dry land. Over many millions of years, these plants developed roots, stems, leaves, and systems that allowed them to survive away from constant water. They also developed ways to reproduce without spending their whole life in water. These changes allowed plants to spread across larger areas of land than ever before. By the beginning of the Carboniferous Period, many kinds of plants had become well suited to life on land. Their roots held firmly in the soil, while their leaves collected sunlight to make food. Their stems carried water and nutrients throughout the plant. These features allowed forests to become much thicker and taller than those of earlier times. As plants spread across the land, they created rich habitats that supported many forms of life. Large parts of the ancient continents were close to the equator. These regions received plenty of heat throughout the year. Rain fell often, keeping the ground wet for long periods. Rivers overflowed during wet seasons and left behind fresh layers of mud and sand. The land remained soft and waterlogged, making it difficult for dead plant material to dry out completely. This created ideal conditions for swamp forests to grow. The forests stretched across broad lowlands where water moved slowly. Instead of steep hills and rocky mountains, many areas were flat and filled with winding rivers. Small lakes formed beside these rivers, while shallow pools collected rainwater. Wet ground covered much of the landscape. Plants grew close together, leaving little open space between them. Thick vegetation covered the land from the ground to the tops of the tallest trees. Many of the tallest plants were not flowering trees because flowering plants had not yet appeared. Instead, giant club mosses, horsetails, seed ferns, and true ferns dominated the forests. Some club mosses reached heights of more than 100 feet. Their trunks were covered with patterns left behind by old leaves that had fallen away as the plant grew taller. Their crowns carried long, narrow leaves that reached towards the sunlight. These giant club mosses belong to groups that are now represented only by very small plants growing close to the ground. During the Carboniferous Period, however, their ancestors formed some of the tallest plants on Earth. Their thick trunks helped support their great height, although their wood was different from the wood found in modern trees. They reproduced by releasing spores rather than seeds. Giant horsetails also formed an important part of these forests. Their stems were divided into sections joined by rings. Branches grew outward from these joints in neat circles. Some of these plants reached heights that would seem surprising today because modern horsetails are usually small plants found near streams and ponds. Their ancient relatives formed dense stands that covered wide areas of wet ground. Ferns also became extremely common throughout the swamp forests. Some grew as low plants covering the forest floor, while others became tall tree ferns with large crowns of leaves. Their wide fronds captured sunlight, filtering through the forest. They reproduced by releasing tiny spores into the air. Wind carried these spores across the landscape, allowing new plants to grow wherever conditions remained suitable. Seed ferns were another major group of plants during this period. Although they looked much like ordinary ferns, they produced seeds instead of spores. This important development allowed them to reproduce in ways that gave their young plants better protection during early growth. Seed ferns spread across many parts of the forests and became an important source of food for some animals. The forest floor remained wet almost all the time. Thick layers of fallen leaves, broken branches, and dead plants covered the ground. Water slowed the breakdown of this plant material. Many kinds of fungi and tiny living organisms worked to break down dead plants, but the wet conditions prevented complete decay. As more plant material accumulated year after year, thick layers of organic matter formed beneath the forests. The air inside these forests was often warm and humid. Mist rose from pools of standing water during cooler parts of the day. Dense leaves blocked much of the sunlight from reaching the ground. Small openings appeared where old trees had fallen or where rivers had changed their course. New plants quickly filled these spaces, keeping the forests thick and crowded. Many rivers flowed through these swamp forests. They carried fresh water from higher ground into the lowlands. During periods of heavy rain, rivers overflowed their banks and spread water across the surrounding forests. Floods deposited fresh mud that added nutrients to the soil. Plants quickly grew in these newly enriched areas. Flooding became an important part of the natural cycle that helped maintain the forests. Shallow lakes also played a major role in the landscape. Some lakes remained connected to rivers, while others became isolated as river channels shifted over time. These lakes supported many kinds of freshwater animals. Fish swam through their waters, while early amphibians hunted along the muddy edges. Plants grew around the shorelines, extending the swamp forests right to the water's edge. The climate remained favorable for plant growth through much of this period. Rainfall occurred frequently, and long dry seasons were uncommon in many swamp regions. High moisture levels allowed plants to grow continuously for much of the year. Since freezing temperatures were rare near the equator, plants did not need to stop growing during cold winters. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere helped support plant growth, because plants used it during photosynthesis to produce food. As forests expanded, they removed large amounts of carbon dioxide from the air. At the same time, they released oxygen through photosynthesis. Over millions of years, these processes contributed to important changes in the Earth's atmosphere. The large amount of oxygen present during parts of the Carboniferous Period supported many forms of animal life. Insects became especially successful during this time. Some insects reached sizes much larger than those seen today. Dragonfly relatives with wide wings flew through the forests. Giant millipedes moved across the damp ground, searching for food. Many smaller insects lived among leaves, bark, and fallen plant material. The thick forests offered many places for animals to hide. Leaves, roots, fallen logs, and standing water created many different living spaces. Small animals found protection beneath decaying wood, while larger animals searched the forests for food. Every part of the swamp provided shelter for living creatures. Early amphibians became common throughout these wet environments. Many depended on water for reproduction because their eggs needed moisture to survive. Swamps provided ideal breeding places with shallow pools and slow-moving streams. Young amphibians grew in the water before moving onto land as adults. The abundance of water made these forests especially important for their survival. Some of the earliest reptiles also appeared during the Carboniferous Period. Unlike amphibians, reptiles developed eggs with protective coverings that allowed reproduction away from open water. This important change allowed them to explore drier parts of the landscape beyond the swamps. Even so, many reptiles continued living near forests because food remained plentiful there. The roots of swamp plants helped hold the soil together. Without these roots, floods could have washed away much of the soft ground. Instead, thick root systems reduced erosion and helped stabilize riverbanks. As plants died and new ones grew, the soil gradually became richer in organic material. Many fallen trees did not fully decay because they remained buried in waterlogged soil. Layer after layer of dead plants built up over long periods. New sediments carried by rivers buried these layers beneath mud and sand. Pressure slowly increased as more material accumulated above them. Over millions of years, these buried plant remains changed into peat and later into coal. The coal found around the world today owes much of its origin to these ancient swamp forests. Thick coal deposits formed where forests existed for very long periods without complete decay of their plant material. These coal beds preserve evidence of the plants that once covered the Earth during the Carboniferous Period. Scientists have learned about these forests by studying fossils found in coal mines, rock layers, and ancient sediments. Fossil leaves, trunks, roots, spores, and seeds provide valuable information about the plants that lived during this period. Some fossil forests remain standing where they originally grew before being buried by sediments. These remarkable discoveries allow researchers to study ancient ecosystems in great detail. The bark of giant club mosses often preserved distinctive patterns that help scientists identify different species. Fossil roots reveal how these plants anchored themselves in wet soils. Spores preserved inside rocks provide information about reproduction and plant diversity. Even tiny pieces of fossil pollen and spores help scientists understand changes in ancient vegetation. Ancient soils beneath fossil forests also provide important evidence. Scientists examine root marks, chemical changes, and preserved organic material to determine how these forests lived. They study the arrangement of plants to understand how different species shared space within the swamps. Every fossil discovery adds another piece to the picture of life during this distant period. The spread of swamp forests influenced weather patterns as well. Thick vegetation released large amounts of water vapor into the air through plant processes. This moisture helped maintain humid conditions in many regions. Clouds formed regularly, bringing more rainfall to areas already rich in plant life. Seasonal changes still occurred, although they were often less extreme near the equator. Periods of heavier rainfall alternated with somewhat drier times. Rivers expanded and contracted as rainfall changed through the seasons. Plants adapted to these natural cycles and continued growing throughout much of the year. The position of the continents also affected the spread of forests. Much of the land existed in large connected masses that stretched across tropical regions. These broad lowlands provided continuous areas where swamp forests could develop. As continents slowly shifted over millions of years, rivers changed course, coastlines moved, and new wetlands appeared while others disappeared. Volcanic activity occasionally affected nearby forests. Ash from volcanic eruptions sometimes settled across the landscape. Fresh volcanic material mixed with soils and influenced plant growth in some areas. Lava flows rarely reached the broad swamp forests, directly because many wetlands lay far from active volcanoes. But volcanic ash became part of the geological record preserved beneath later sediments. Storms also shaped these forests. Strong winds occasionally knocked down large trees, creating open spaces where sunlight reached the ground. Young plants quickly grew in these clearings. Heavy rainfall during storms caused rivers to flood more frequently, depositing fresh sediments across the swamps. These natural disturbances became part of the continuing cycle of forest growth. The forests contained many layers of vegetation. Tall plants formed the upper part of the forest, while smaller ferns and young plants filled lower levels. Mosses covered damp surfaces, and fungi helped recycle nutrients from dead material. Every layer supported different forms of life adapted to its particular conditions. Sunlight reaching the forest floor varied from place to place. Thick canopies blocked much of the light, creating cool, shaded areas beneath tall plants. Open spaces received brighter light and supported different groups of plants. This variety of light conditions increased the diversity of vegetation within the forests. The constant supply of water allowed many plants to grow close together without competing for moisture. Roots spread through soft mud rich in organic material. Water carried dissolved nutrients through the soil, providing plants with materials needed for growth. The slow movement of water reduced soil drying and helped maintain stable conditions. Insects played important roles within these forests. Some fed on leaves, stems and spores, while others broke down dead plant material. Predatory insects hunted smaller animals among the vegetation. Flying insects carried spores and may have accidentally helped spread certain plant materials from one place to another. Spiders also lived within the forests, hunting insects among leaves and fallen branches. Early relatives of modern scorpions searched for prey across the damp ground. Many small animals spent their entire lives hidden beneath thick layers of vegetation, rarely exposed to direct sunlight. Fish living in rivers and lakes became an important food source for amphibians and other animals. Some fish adapted to shallow waters, where oxygen levels changed throughout the year. Lungfish and other ancient groups survived in these environments, using special breathing methods. Freshwater ecosystems connected closely with the surrounding forests. The edges between land and water constantly changed. Rivers shifted their channels over time, cutting new paths through the forests. Old channels filled with sediment and became new wetlands covered by plants. Lakes gradually filled with organic matter until vegetation spread across their surfaces. These slow changes continually reshaped the landscape. Many plants reproduced by releasing enormous numbers of spores into the air. Winds carried these tiny structures over long distances. When spores landed in wet places, they could grow into new plants if conditions remained favorable. This method allowed forests to spread rapidly across suitable land. Seed-producing plants also expanded during the Carboniferous Period. Seeds protected young plants during early development and allowed reproduction in places where standing water might not always be available. This adaptation became increasingly important as some regions experienced changes in climate toward the later part of the period. As forests continued growing over millions of years, thick layers of vegetation removed large amounts of carbon from the atmosphere and stored it within plant tissues. When these plants died, much of their carbon became trapped beneath waterlogged soils instead of immediately returning to the air. This long-term storage played an important part in Earth's carbon cycle. The cooling of some parts of the world later in the Carboniferous Period affected the spread of forests. Large ice sheets developed in southern regions while tropical swamps continued existing closer to the equator. Changing sea levels influenced the extent of coastal wetlands. Some forests disappeared beneath rising waters, while new land became available when sea levels fell. These repeated changes created alternating layers of coal, sandstone, shale, and limestone in many regions. Each layer recorded a different stage in the changing environment. Coal represented periods when forests flourished, while other rock layers reflected flooding, shallow seas, or river activity. The plants that filled the forests of the Carboniferous Period created one of the richest natural environments in Earth's history. These forests spread across large areas of land where the climate stayed warm and wet for long periods. Rain fell often, rivers overflowed, and wide lowlands stayed soaked with water. These conditions allowed many kinds of plants to grow in huge numbers. Thick forests covered swamps, river valleys, floodplains, and other wet places. The ground was soft, muddy, and rich with plant material that continued to collect over many generations. Many of the plants that lived during this time looked very different from the trees and flowers that are common today. Flowering plants had not yet appeared. There were no grasses covering the ground. There were no fruit trees producing apples, oranges, or other familiar fruits. Instead, the forests contained giant club mosses, tall horsetails, seed ferns, true ferns, early seed-bearing plants, and several other groups that have either disappeared or survive today, only as much smaller relatives. The giant club mosses were among the most common plants in these forests. Although they are called club mosses, they were not true mosses. Modern club mosses are small plants that usually grow close to the ground, but their ancient relatives reached the height of large trees. Some stood well over 100 feet tall. Their trunks were straight and covered with diamond-shaped marks left behind by fallen leaves. These marks created a repeating pattern along the outside of the trunk. Scientists have found many fossils showing these patterns, making these plants easy to recognize. The roots of these giant club mosses spread across the wet soil rather than growing very deeply into the ground. The soft, swampy land often did not allow roots to reach great depths. Instead, the roots formed wide networks that helped support the tall trunks. These root systems also absorbed water and nutrients from the muddy ground. Fossils of these roots have been found in many former coal swamps around the world. The leaves of giant club mosses grew in large numbers near the tops of their trunks. Each leaf was long and narrow. Together, they formed green crowns that captured sunlight. The leaves carried out photosynthesis, using sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide to produce food for the plant. This process also released oxygen into the atmosphere. Because these forests covered such large areas, they played an important part in changing the amount of oxygen in the air over millions of years. Instead of flowers or fruits, giant club mosses reproduced by releasing spores. These spores formed inside cone-like structures that developed near the tops of the trees. When the spores became mature, they were released into the air. Wind carried them away from the parent plant. If they landed in wet places with the right conditions, they could begin new stages of growth that eventually produced another generation of plants. Some giant club mosses produced two different sizes of spores. Larger spores developed into female structures, while smaller spores developed into male structures. This system improved the chances of successful reproduction. It also represented an important step in the long history of plant evolution, because it showed increasing specialization in reproductive methods. One well-known giant club moss was Lepidodendron. It became one of the most successful trees of the Carboniferous forests. Huge numbers of these trees grew together across swampy lowlands. Fossils of Lepidodendron trunks, roots, leaves, and cones have been found on several continents. These discoveries show that the plant spread across many parts of the ancient world. Another important giant club moss was Sigillaria. This tree also reached great heights, but looked somewhat different from Lepidodendron. Its trunk showed vertical rows of leaf scars instead of the diamond-shaped pattern seen in many other club mosses. The scars formed regular lines running from the base of the trunk toward the crown. Like other giant club mosses, Sigillaria reproduced through spores and lived mainly in wet swamp environments. The trunks of these giant plants did not become thicker throughout their lives in the same way that many modern trees do. Their growth pattern was different from the trees seen in forests today. Much of their strength came from their outer tissues, rather than from thick layers of wood. This allowed them to grow quickly in the favourable conditions of Carboniferous swamps. Horsetails also formed an important part of these forests. Modern horsetails survive today, but they are usually only a few feet tall. During the Carboniferous period, some relatives reached the height of trees. These giant horsetails belong to a group known as calamites. They often grew along riverbanks, lake edges and swamp margins where water remained available throughout the year. The stems of calamites were hollow inside and divided into many jointed sections. Rings marked the points where branches and leaves grew. This structure made the plants flexible enough to withstand wind while still growing tall. Their roots spread through wet soil and often produced many new stems from underground connections. The leaves of giant horsetails were much smaller than those of giant club mosses. They usually formed circles around each joint of the stem. Their green stems also carried out much of the photosynthesis needed to produce food. This allowed the plants to continue growing even with relatively small leaves. Like the giant club mosses, giant horsetails reproduced through spores rather than seeds. Cone-like structures developed near the tops of the stems. Inside these cones, spores matured before being released into the surrounding environment. Moist conditions helped these spores complete their life cycle. True ferns covered much of the forest floor and also climbed into open spaces beneath the forest canopy. Some remained low-growing plants, while others developed trunks and became tree ferns. These tree ferns formed an important layer within the forests, adding to the thick vegetation that filled the swamps. Fern leaves, called fronds, often grew very large, each frond divided into many smaller leaflets. These wide surfaces collected sunlight, filtering through the forest canopy. Ferns produced spores on the undersides of their fronds. Tiny structures held these spores until they matured and were ready for release. The life cycle of ferns depended strongly on water. After spores landed in suitable places, they developed into very small plant stages that required moisture for successful reproduction. Without enough water, fertilization could not take place. The constantly wet conditions of Carboniferous swamps provided ideal surroundings for this process. Seed ferns formed another major group of forest plants. Although they looked much like ordinary ferns because of their large divided leaves, they reproduced with seeds instead of spores. This made them different from true ferns, even though their appearance often seemed very similar. The seeds of these plants gave developing young plants protection during early growth. The seed contained stored food that supported the embryo until it could begin making its own food through photosynthesis. This adaptation allowed seed ferns to survive in a wider range of conditions than plants depending entirely on spores. Many seed ferns developed thick, woody stems that helped support their large leaves. Some became small trees, while others formed climbing plants that spread through the forest. Their leaves often measured several feet in length and created thick layers of shade beneath the forest canopy. The seeds themselves were not enclosed inside fruits because flowering plants had not yet evolved. Instead, they developed on exposed structures attached to the leaves or branches. Wind probably carried pollen from one plant to another in many species. Chordates represented another important group of seed-bearing plants. These trees often grew taller than many neighbouring plants and sometimes occupied slightly drier ground near the edges of swamps. Their long, strap-like leaves differed from the divided leaves of ferns and seed ferns. Chordates produced seeds as well as pollen. Their reproductive structures developed on separate cones. Wind carried pollen through the forest, allowing fertilization to occur without requiring standing water for sperm movement. This adaptation gave these plants an advantage in areas that occasionally became less wet. The trunks of Chordates contained more wood than many giant club mosses. Their stronger stems allowed them to grow into tall trees, capable of reaching sunlight above much of the surrounding vegetation. Fossil wood from these plants has helped scientists understand the structure of early seed-bearing forests. The Carboniferous forests contained many smaller plants growing beneath the larger trees. Mosses covered damp ground, fallen trunks and rocks. Liverworts spread across moist surfaces. Small club mosses and smaller horsetails filled spaces left between larger plants. Many tiny ferns occupied shaded places where sunlight reached only in limited amounts. These smaller plants played important roles within the forest. They helped hold soil together, slowed the movement of water across the ground, and created homes for many insects and other small animals. They also added more plant material to the growing layers of dead vegetation that collected within the swamps. The forests showed several layers of plant life. Tall trees formed the highest level. Beneath them grew medium-sized plants such as tree ferns and younger trees. Closer to the ground lived smaller ferns, mosses, horsetails and seedlings. This layered arrangement allowed many different kinds of plants to live within the same area because each group received enough light to survive. Sunlight entering the forest became weaker as it passed through each layer of leaves. Plants growing near the ground adapted to lower light levels. Their leaves captured the available sunlight efficiently, allowing them to continue making food even beneath the thick canopy. The wet climate supported constant plant growth through much of the year. Because temperatures remained warm, many plants did not experience long periods of complete dormancy. Leaves continued growing, roots absorbed water, and new stems developed whenever conditions remained favorable. Flooding happened often within these swamp forests. Rivers overflowed their banks, covering large areas with water and fresh layers of mud. Many Carboniferous plants tolerated flooding very well. Their root systems continued functioning in waterlogged soils, where many modern trees would struggle to survive. Some plants developed tissues containing air spaces that helped move oxygen to roots buried beneath wet soil. These internal air passages allowed roots to continue functioning even when surrounded by water. Such adaptations increase survival in constantly flooded environments. Dead leaves, branches, trunks, roots and spores accumulated year after year on swamp floors. Because oxygen levels inside the muddy ground remained very low, many dead plants decomposed slowly. Layer after layer of plant material built up over long periods. Sediments buried these layers beneath additional mud and sand delivered by rivers. As burial continued over millions of years, pressure and heat slowly changed much of this plant material into peat and eventually into coal. Many coal deposits mined today formed from these ancient Carboniferous forests. Fossil remains preserved inside coal layers provide valuable evidence about the plants that once grew there. Plant growth also influenced the atmosphere. Through photosynthesis, Carboniferous forests removed carbon dioxide from the air while releasing oxygen. The enormous amount of plant life contributed to long-term changes in atmospheric composition. Scientists believe oxygen levels became much higher than those found today during parts of the Carboniferous period. Higher oxygen levels affected many living organisms, including insects and other animals. The rich plant life supported large food webs throughout the forests. Plant-eating animals fed directly on leaves, stems, spores and seeds. Predators then hunted these plant-eating animals. The forests supplied food, shelter and breeding places for many forms of life. Many insects fed on leaves by chewing holes through plant tissue. Others sucked fluids from stems or roots. Fossil leaves often show feeding marks that reveal these ancient interactions between insects and plants. These marks help scientists understand early plant-animal relationships. Some insects laid eggs inside plant tissues, developing young fed on the surrounding material before emerging as adults. Other insects used fallen logs, dead leaves, or bark as safe places for hiding or reproduction. The thick vegetation created countless small habitats supporting many different species. Fungi also lived throughout these forests. They helped break down dead wood, leaves, and roots wherever oxygen allowed decomposition to occur. Different fungal species specialized in different kinds of plant material. Their activity recycled nutrients back into the soil, supporting continued plant growth. Bacteria carried out additional decomposition within the upper layers of swamp soils. However, waterlogged conditions slowed the work of many microorganisms. This reduced rate of decay allowed dead plant material to accumulate much faster than it disappeared. Plant roots helped stabilize riverbanks and swamp edges. Their underground networks reduced erosion by holding loose soil together. During floods, these roots trapped sediment carried by flowing water. Fresh deposits of mud created new areas where young plants could become established. Spores filled the air during reproductive seasons. Winds carried countless microscopic spores across forests, rivers, and nearby plains. Some traveled only short distances, while others spread much farther before landing. Lakes and swamps trapped many spores within sediments, allowing them to become fossils preserved for millions of years. Scientists study fossil spores under powerful microscopes because each plant group produced spores with distinctive shapes and surface patterns. These tiny fossils help identify the kinds of plants growing in ancient environments even when larger plant remains are absent. Plant fossils occur in several forms. Some fossils preserve complete trunks lying where they originally fell. Others preserve leaves flattened between layers of rock. Fossil roots remain attached to ancient soil surfaces. Seeds, cones, spores, pollen grains, bark, branches, and wood all provide valuable information about Carboniferous vegetation. In some locations, entire forests became buried rapidly by floods or volcanic ash. Quick burial protected plant remains from complete decay. These exceptional fossil sites preserve remarkable details, including leaf veins, bark textures, reproductive structures, and even microscopic cells in some cases. The spread of seed-bearing plants gradually increased during the later part of the Carboniferous period. Seeds offered important advantages because they protected young plants and reduced dependence on standing water for reproduction. Over long periods, these plants became increasingly successful across changing environments. Despite this gradual increase, spore-producing plants remained dominant throughout much of the Carboniferous forests. Giant club mosses, tree ferns, giant horsetails, and many other spore-producing groups continued covering extensive swamp landscapes. Climate differences influenced which plants dominated different regions. Areas with deeper standing water favored giant club mosses and certain ferns. Slightly higher ground often supported chordates and other seed-bearing plants. River channels created changing patterns of wet and dry conditions that influenced plant distribution across the landscape. Storms occasionally damaged the forests by breaking branches or knocking down trees. Fallen trunks created open spaces where sunlight reached the forest floor. These openings allowed young plants to grow rapidly until the canopy closed again. Forest structure therefore changed gradually through natural cycles of growth, death, and replacement. Fire appears to have occurred in some Carboniferous forests because fossil charcoal has been discovered in rocks from this time. Higher oxygen levels may have allowed fires to burn more easily under suitable conditions. After fires, surviving plants and newly growing seedlings gradually recolonized burned areas. Different plant species responded differently to changing water levels. Some tolerated long periods of flooding, while others preferred ground that dried occasionally. Seasonal shifts in rainfall and river flow therefore influenced local plant communities even within the generally wet Carboniferous climate. The bark of many Carboniferous trees differed greatly from modern trees. In giant club mosses, the outer layers often carried much of the structural support. Their bark remained thick and strong, while the inner tissues differed from those of many living trees. Fossil bark provides important clues about growth patterns and plant biology. Leaves varied greatly among different plant groups. Giant club mosses produced narrow leaves attached individually along stems. Ferns developed divided fronds made of many leaflets. Chordates formed long ribbon-like leaves. Seed ferns combined fern-like leaf shapes with seed reproduction. This diversity allowed plants to occupy many different positions within the forests. Water moved through plant tissues from roots toward leaves. Specialized conducting cells transported water upward, while other tissues carried sugars produced through photosynthesis to growing parts of the plant. These transport systems supported the development of very tall plants despite their enormous size. Roots absorbed dissolved minerals along with water. These nutrients supported growth, leaf production, reproduction, and repair of damaged tissues. Rich swamp soils supplied many of the materials needed for continuous plant growth. Many plants shed leaves throughout their lives. Fallen leaves collected on the forest floor where they mixed with branches, spores, bark, and other organic matter. Thick layers of plant litter developed beneath the forests, especially in places where floodwaters deposited additional sediment. The changing paths of rivers continually reshaped Carboniferous landscapes. New channels formed while older ones filled with sediment. Plant communities shifted in response to these environmental changes. Areas once covered by water eventually supported forests, while older forests sometimes became buried beneath river deposits. The long history of Carboniferous vegetation shows how plants transformed entire regions of the ancient world. Through steady growth, reproduction, and the continual accumulation of organic material, these forests became one of the defining features of the Carboniferous landscape. Giant club mosses, towering horsetails, tree ferns, seed ferns, chordates, mosses, liverworts, and many smaller plants together created dense forests that stretched across wide swampy plains, filling the land with living vegetation and leaving behind the plant remains that later became some of the largest coal deposits preserved within Earth's crust. During the Carboniferous period, large parts of the land were covered by thick forests that stayed green and continued growing for very long stretches of time. These forests spread across wide lowlands where the ground stayed wet because rivers overflowed often and heavy rainfall kept the soil full of water. Many of these places became swamps filled with standing water, soft mud, fallen leaves, broken branches, and the remains of countless plants. These conditions played a major part in the long, natural process that eventually formed the coal deposits found in many parts of the world today. The forests were made up of many kinds of ancient plants. Giant club mosses stood high above the swamp floor. Huge horsetails grew in thick groups beside streams and ponds. Seed ferns spread their leaves through the damp landscape, while many kinds of true ferns filled open spaces with rich green growth. Every year these plants produced new stems, leaves, roots, and branches. Older parts of the plants died while fresh growth continued to appear. This constant cycle meant that enormous amounts of plant material collected on the ground over very long periods of time. When leaves dropped from the tops of trees, they landed on soft, wet ground. Branches that broke during storms also fell into the swamp. Entire trees sometimes collapsed because of old age, disease, flooding, or changing river channels. Once these plants reached the swamp floor, they did not disappear quickly. The water covering the ground prevented many living organisms from breaking down the dead plant material at the speed seen in dry forests today. The wet soil contained very little oxygen because standing water filled the spaces between the soil particles. Oxygen is important for many tiny living things that feed on dead plants. Without enough oxygen, these tiny organisms could not fully break down the fallen wood, leaves, roots, and stems. Instead of completely disappearing, much of the plant material remained in the swamp and slowly built up into thick layers. This slow build-up happened again and again over many thousands of years. Every growing season added more plant material to the swamp floor. Floods brought fresh mud and sand from nearby rivers. New forests grew on top of older layers of dead plants. When these newer forests also died, they added another layer. As this cycle continued, the ground became filled with thick deposits of partly broken plant remains. One important stage in this long process was the formation of peat. Peat is made from dead plant material that has only partly broken down. It forms mainly in wet places where there is little oxygen. During the Carboniferous Period, huge areas of peat developed beneath the swamp forests. These peat beds sometimes reached great thickness because plant growth continued for extremely long periods while decay remained slow. The peat contained pieces of leaves, bark, roots, stems, spores, and wood. Many of these plant parts could still be recognized when they first became buried. As more material collected above them, the older layers were pressed together. Water slowly moved out of the peat as the weight increased. The soft plant material became more tightly packed, and its structure slowly changed. Floods often covered the peat with fresh layers of mud, clay, or sand. Rivers changed direction across the landscape, leaving behind new deposits. Lakes expanded and later shrank. Some swamp forests were buried by river sediments after major floods. This covering protected the peat from being washed away and helped keep it buried beneath newer layers of earth. After one forest disappeared, another often grew on the fresh surface created by the flood deposits. The warm climate and plentiful water allowed plants to return quickly. New trees spread across the land and fresh swamps developed once again. These new forests repeated the same cycle of growth, death, burial, and peat formation. Because this happened many times, layers of coal found today are often separated by layers of sandstone, shale, or other rock that formed between different forest periods. As the buried peat sank deeper into the ground, pressure continued to increase. Every new layer of mud, sand, or plant material added extra weight. This pressure squeezed the peat more tightly. Water was pushed out little by little. The plant remains became denser as empty spaces disappeared. At the same time, natural heat inside the earth slowly warmed the buried layers. The increase in heat and pressure caused chemical changes inside the peat. Some substances were removed while others became more concentrated. The amount of carbon slowly increased because other elements left the buried material over very long periods. Carbon became the main part of the developing coal. This process happened naturally without any human involvement and required an immense amount of time. The first type of coal formed from peat is called lignite in many places. Lignite still contains a noticeable amount of moisture and has a lower amount of carbon than other forms of coal. If burial continued and heat and pressure kept increasing, lignite slowly changed into bituminous coal. Bituminous coal contains more carbon and stores more energy. Under even greater heat and pressure, some coal changed further into anthracite, which contains a very high amount of carbon and burns with great heat. Not every coal deposit reached the same stage of development. The depth of burial, the amount of pressure, the surrounding rocks, and the natural heat beneath the ground all affected how much change took place. Some deposits remained as lignite because they did not experience enough heat or pressure. Others continued changing for millions of years until they became anthracite. The formation of coal required a very special combination of conditions. Thick forests alone were not enough. The forests also needed wet ground, where plant remains could collect without breaking down completely. The area had to remain stable for long periods, so peat could continue building. Later, the peat had to be buried beneath sediments that protected it while allowing pressure and heat to slowly transform it into coal. The Carboniferous climate helped support these conditions. Warm temperatures encouraged rapid plant growth across large swampy regions. Rainfall remained high in many places, keeping the land wet throughout much of the year. Rivers carried fresh sediments into the swamps while continuing to create new wetlands as they changed their paths across the lowlands. Many ancient rivers flowed slowly through flat landscapes. During floods, water spread across wide areas instead of remaining inside narrow river channels. Fine mud settled over the swamp floor after floodwaters became calm. This mud covered fallen plants and protected them from being carried away. Over time, repeated flooding built thick layers above the buried peat. Sea levels also changed from time to time during the Carboniferous period. In some places, shallow seas moved inland and later retreated. These changing coastlines added different layers of sediment over the peat beds. Marine deposits sometimes covered the swamps before forests returned once again. This created repeating rock layers that can still be seen by geologists studying ancient coalfields today. The roots of swamp plant also played an important part in coal formation. Roots spread through soft, muddy ground and held plant material together. When the plants died, the roots remained buried in the soil. Many fossil root systems have been found beneath coal layers, showing exactly where ancient forests once stood before they disappeared beneath sediments. Plant bark contributed large amounts of material to the developing peat. Some Carboniferous trees had thick bark that regularly peeled away during growth. This bark collected on the swamp floor in great quantities. Because decay remained slow in waterlogged conditions, much of the bark stayed preserved long enough to become part of the growing peat deposits. Spores released by ancient plants also settled into the swamps. Countless tiny spores drifted through the air before landing on wet ground or still water. Over time, they became mixed with leaves, stems, roots, and other plant remains. These spores can still be found under microscopes inside some coal deposits today, helping scientists identify the plants that lived in ancient forests. Many insects lived among these forests. When insects died, some became trapped in muddy areas or shallow water. Their remains occasionally entered the peat along with plant material. Small amphibians and other animals also sometimes died within the swamps and became buried. Although coal mainly formed from plants, small amounts of animal remains can also be found within some deposits. The slow movement of water inside many swamps helped preserve plant remains. Fast-moving rivers often carried dead plants away before thick layers could build up. Quiet swamps allowed leaves and branches to settle gently onto the bottom. The lack of strong water movement reduced disturbance and helped the peat continue growing. Different plant species added different materials to the peat. Some trees contributed thick, woody trunks. Ferns added delicate leaves and stems. Horsetails supplied hollow stems with jointed sections. Club mosses provided bark, roots, and branches. Together, these different plant parts formed the rich mixture that later became coal. As buried peat changed into coal, it became thinner than the original plant layers. Thick peat deposits were compressed into much thinner coal seams because water and gases escaped while pressure squeezed the material together. This explains why coal seams are usually much thinner than the amount of plant material originally needed to create them. Coal seams vary greatly in thickness. Some are only a small distance thick, while others reach several meters. Their thickness depends on how long peat accumulated before burial, how much plant material entered the swamp, and how much compression occurred during the transformation into coal. Coal seams are often found deep underground because millions of years of additional sediments covered them after they formed. Mountain building, shifting land, erosion, and other geological events later changed the landscape. In some places, erosion removed upper rock layers, bringing coal closer to the surface. In other places, coal remained buried beneath thick layers of rock. Movements within the Earth's crust also affected coal deposits. Some layers were folded into curved shapes as the land slowly changed. Others were broken by faults that shifted sections of rock upward or downward. These natural changes influenced where coal could later be reached by mining. Ancient forests did not produce coal everywhere they grew. Some forests decayed completely before burial. Others were destroyed by changing river systems or long dry periods that allowed greater decay. Only places where the right conditions continued for long enough eventually formed large coal deposits. The chemical makeup of coal continued changing slowly during burial. Carbon became more concentrated, while hydrogen and oxygen were reduced. These gradual chemical changes increased the amount of stored energy within the coal. The longer the process continued under suitable conditions, the greater the concentration of carbon became. Water remained one of the most important parts of coal formation. Without permanently wet conditions, dead plants would have broken down much faster. Water blocked much of the oxygen needed for complete decay and created the environment that allowed peat to build year after year. The ground beneath many Carboniferous swamps slowly sank over time. This gradual sinking created more space for sediments and plant material to collect. As the land lowered, rivers continued bringing fresh deposits, while forests kept growing above the sinking surface. This balance between sinking land and growing forests allowed very thick peat layers to develop. Volcanic ash sometimes settled over parts of ancient forests after distant volcanic eruptions. Thin ash layers became buried together with plant remains. These layers can still be identified today and help scientists determine the order in which different rock layers formed. The remains of ancient trees inside coal deposits often show details of their original structure. Fossil wood, bark patterns, leaf scars, and root markings provide valuable information about the forests that existed during the Carboniferous period. Careful study of these fossils allows scientists to identify the different plant groups that contributed to coal formation. Many coal deposits contain fossils in the surrounding rocks rather than inside the coal itself. Shales above and below coal seams often preserve leaves, seeds, stems, insects, freshwater animals, and footprints left by early land animals. These fossils help reconstruct the environment that existed when the coal-forming forests were alive. The repeated pattern of coal seams separated by sedimentary rocks tells the story of changing landscapes. Forests grew during stable wet periods. Floods buried the forests beneath mud and sand. New forests later returned to the surface. This repeating cycle continued many times over long stretches of geological history. Some ancient peat deposits never became coal because later erosion removed them before deep burial could occur. Wind, rivers, and changing landscapes sometimes exposed peat layers at the surface where complete decay eventually took place. Only buried peat had the chance to continue changing into coal. The quality of coal depends partly on the kinds of plants that originally formed the peat. Forests rich in woody plants often produce different coal characteristics from those containing larger amounts of softer plant material. Local environmental conditions also affected the final properties of the coal. Microorganisms still played a role in peat formation even though oxygen remained limited. Certain bacteria were able to survive under low oxygen conditions and slowly changed some of the plant material. Their activity was much slower than the decay that happens in well-aerated soils, allowing large amounts of organic matter to remain preserved. As deeper burial continued, temperatures gradually increased because heat naturally rises from within the earth. This steady warming happened very slowly over millions of years. The changing temperature worked together with pressure to drive the chemical reactions that transformed peat into coal. The minerals carried by groundwater also entered buried peat. Small amounts of minerals settled into spaces within the plant material. These minerals became part of the finished coal or remained in the surrounding rocks. Different mineral contents affect the appearance and quality of coal found in different regions. Coal deposits formed across many parts of the ancient world where Carboniferous swamp forests existed. Areas that are now found in North America, Europe, and Asia preserve large coal fields created during this period. At the time these forests were growing, the positions of the continents were different from those seen today, but similar swamp conditions existed across many regions. As later geological events changed the Earth's surface, some coal deposits were lifted into mountain ranges, while others remained beneath broad plains. Rivers cut through rocks and exposed coal layers along valley walls. Natural erosion sometimes revealed coal at the surface long before people learned how to mine and use it. People much later discovered that coal could produce heat when burned. Over time, it became an important source of fuel for homes, industries, transportation, and electricity. The energy stored inside coal originally came from sunlight, captured by ancient plants during the Carboniferous forests. Through photosynthesis, those plants used sunlight to produce the tissues that later became buried within the swamps. Each piece of coal represents the remains of countless plants that lived, died, accumulated, and changed over immense spans of time. A single coal seam contains material from leaves that drifted into quiet pools, trunks that fell into muddy water, roots that remained buried beneath the soil, bark that peeled from growing trees, and spores that settled across the swamp floor. Scientists study coal by examining its chemical composition, fossil content, and the rock layers surrounding it. These studies reveal information about ancient climates, rainfall patterns, plant communities, river systems, and geological changes that occurred while the coal-forming forests existed. Careful examination also helps identify the age of different coal deposits and the environmental conditions present during their formation. Modern mining exposes cross-sections through ancient coal seams, allowing researchers to see the layers created during peat accumulation. Thin bands inside the coal sometimes represent seasonal changes, flood events, or differences in plant material entering the swamp. These details provide valuable records of environments that existed hundreds of millions of years ago. The coal-forming forests supported rich ecosystems filled with insects, amphibians, early reptiles, fish living in nearby waters, and countless smaller organisms. Their activities formed part of the living environment, while plants continued growing and producing the material that slowly accumulated into peat. Even though the coal itself mainly comes from plants, the surrounding ecosystems influenced how organic material moved through the swamps. Changes in rainfall affected the amount of plant growth each year. Wetter periods supported expanding swamp forests, while temporary changes in water levels influenced how much peat accumulated. Flooding sometimes buried large amounts of plant material at once, adding new layers that later became compressed within the growing peat deposit. The slow pace of coal formation meant that no single forest created an entire coal seam in a short period. Instead, many generations of plants lived and died in the same region. Forests repeatedly renewed themselves as older plants disappeared and younger plants replaced them. This continuous cycle supplied fresh organic material over extremely long periods. As sediments continued covering the buried peat, the surrounding rocks hardened into shale, sandstone, mudstone, and other sedimentary rocks. These rocks protected the coal layers and preserved the record of ancient environments. Today, geologists read these rock sequences to understand the changing landscapes that allowed thick forests to become the world's coal deposits. During the Carboniferous period, the amount of oxygen in Earth's atmosphere was much greater than it is now. Scientists believe that oxygen reached about 35% of the atmosphere, while today it is about 21%. This was one of the most important features of the Carboniferous world, because oxygen affected plants, animals, insects, fires, oceans, and the general environment. The high level of oxygen did not happen suddenly. It developed slowly over millions of years because of several natural processes working together. These processes included the growth of huge forests, the burial of large amounts of dead plant material, changes in the movement of continents, the behavior of tiny living organisms, and the balance between oxygen production and oxygen use. Oxygen is a gas that many living things need in order to survive. Animals breathe oxygen because their bodies use it to release energy from food. Plants also use oxygen, especially during the night, even though they produce oxygen during the day through photosynthesis. Many tiny organisms in the soil and water also depend on oxygen. The amount of oxygen in the atmosphere changes very slowly over long periods, because it depends on how much oxygen is produced and how much is removed. The main source of oxygen on Earth is photosynthesis. During photosynthesis, green plants, algae, and some bacteria use sunlight to change water and carbon dioxide into food. As part of this process, oxygen is released into the air. Every leaf on every green plant plays a part in this process. The more healthy plants there are, the more oxygen can be produced. During the Carboniferous period, enormous forests covered large areas of the land. These forests stretched across wide, swampy regions where the ground stayed wet for long periods. The climate in many places was warm and humid, allowing plants to grow quickly. These forests contain giant club mosses, horsetails, tree ferns, seed ferns, and early seed-bearing plants. Many of these plants grew very tall and packed closely together, forming thick forests that covered huge areas. These forests produced massive amounts of leaves, stems, roots, and wood every year. As plants grew, they took carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and released oxygen through photosynthesis. Since the forests were so large and active, they released enormous amounts of oxygen into the air over very long periods. Normally, when plants die, bacteria and fungi break down the dead material. This process uses oxygen. As dead plants decay, much of the carbon stored inside them returns to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. This creates a balance because oxygen produced during plant growth is later used again during decay. During the Carboniferous period, this balance changed. Many forests grew in swampy places where the ground was covered with water. The water slowed the breakdown of dead plants because many organisms that normally cause decay could not work as effectively in wet, low oxygen conditions. Instead of breaking apart completely, large amounts of plant material piled up layer after layer. Over time, more plants died and covered the older layers. Mud, sand, and other sediments buried these thick layers of dead vegetation. As millions of years passed, heat and pressure slowly changed the buried plant material into peat and later into coal. Because so much carbon became locked underground, instead of returning to the atmosphere, oxygen remained in the air. This process is one of the most important reasons why oxygen levels rose so high during the Carboniferous period. Every time carbon stayed buried underground, instead of returning to the atmosphere, oxygen was left behind. Over millions of years, this caused oxygen levels to increase steadily. Coal deposits found around the world today provide strong evidence for this process. Thick layers of coal show that vast amounts of plant material were buried before they could fully decay. These coal beds formed slowly over very long periods. Many of the world's major coal deposits began during the Carboniferous period, because conditions were especially suitable for preserving dead plants. The movement of Earth's continents also helped create the right conditions. During much of the Carboniferous period, many land areas were located close to the equator. These regions received plenty of sunlight and rainfall. Warm temperatures and abundant water allowed forests to grow throughout much of the year. Since plants had long growing seasons, they produced even more organic material than forests in cooler climates. Large river systems carried water into wide lowland areas. Flooding happened often. Rivers spread fresh sediments across swamp forests, while also creating new wetlands. These wetlands remained waterlogged for long periods, protecting dead plants from complete decay. The shape of the land also played an important part. Flat landscapes allowed water to remain in place instead of draining away quickly. Standing water created conditions where oxygen inside the soil remained low. Without enough oxygen, many organisms responsible for breaking down dead plants became less active. This allowed thick layers of plant material to survive. The kinds of plants living during the Carboniferous period also affected oxygen production. Many plants grew rapidly and reached large sizes. Their stems, leaves, and roots stored large amounts of carbon. Every year, these plants added more plant matter to the forests. As forests expanded, photosynthesis continued to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere while releasing oxygen. Some forests remained in place for very long periods. Instead of disappearing after a short time, new generations of plants often replaced older ones in the same swampy regions. This allowed oxygen production to continue over millions of years without major interruptions. Scientists also think that fungi capable of breaking down certain tough plant tissues were less effective during parts of the Carboniferous period than similar fungi are today. Many plants contained a substance called lignin, which strengthens wood and makes stems more rigid. lignin is difficult to break down. If fewer organisms were able to digest it completely, more woody material would remain buried instead of decaying. As woody material accumulated in swamps, additional carbon stayed underground. Every layer of buried wood represented carbon removed from the atmosphere for extremely long periods. Since that carbon did not return quickly as carbon dioxide, oxygen levels continued to rise. Tiny living organisms also played important roles. Bacteria living in soils, lakes, rivers and oceans help recycle nutrients and break down dead material. Changes in bacterial activity can affect how quickly carbon returns to the atmosphere. During the Carboniferous period, wet conditions in many forests reduced the work of oxygen-dependent bacteria inside waterlogged soils. Marine organisms also influenced oxygen levels. Tiny algae floating in ancient seas carried out photosynthesis just as plants did on land. These organisms absorbed carbon dioxide and released oxygen. When some of them died, part of their remains settled to the seafloor. If these remains became buried beneath sediments before complete decay, additional carbon became stored underground. Ocean chemistry changed throughout Earth's history. Changes in nutrient supplies affected how many microscopic organisms could grow. In some places, nutrient-rich waters supported abundant life, increasing photosynthesis and oxygen production. Volcanic activity also influenced Earth's atmosphere over long periods. Volcanoes release carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere. During some periods, volcanic activity increased atmospheric carbon dioxide, encouraging plant growth if enough water and sunlight were available. At other times, lower volcanic activity reduced the amount of carbon dioxide entering the atmosphere. The balance between volcanic gases, plant growth, weathering of rocks, and burial of carbon influenced atmospheric oxygen over millions of years. Mountain building affected oxygen levels in indirect ways. When mountains rose, rain and rivers wore away rocks. Weathering removed carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through natural chemical reactions. Rivers carried dissolved materials into the oceans, where they became part of marine sediments. This long-term process also helped shape Earth's atmosphere. Climate changes during the Carboniferous period influenced oxygen production. Warm temperatures encouraged rapid plant growth across many tropical regions. High rainfall kept swamps wet throughout much of the year. These conditions favored both forest expansion and preservation of dead plants. Later during the Carboniferous period, glaciers expanded across parts of the southern continents. Even though large ice sheets formed in some regions, tropical forests continued to exist near the equator. Climate changes caused sea levels to rise and fall many times. Each rise and fall changed the size and location of swamp forests. When sea levels fell, new land became available for forests. When sea levels rose, sediments buried existing forests. Repeated cycles of forest growth, burial, and new forest development created many layers of coal over millions of years. The atmosphere during the Carboniferous period contained different amounts of gases than today. Carbon dioxide levels changed through time as forest expanded and carbon became buried. Oxygen gradually increased because of the continued removal of carbon from the atmosphere. Scientists study ancient rocks to estimate past oxygen levels. They examine coal deposits, fossil soils, ancient charcoal, chemical changes inside rocks, and the remains of plants and animals. These clues help researchers estimate how Earth's atmosphere changed over millions of years. Ancient charcoal provides useful information because fires require oxygen to burn. If oxygen levels become too low, fires cannot spread easily. If oxygen becomes much higher, fires can start more easily and burn more intensely. Charcoal found in Carboniferous rocks suggests that wildfires occurred even in damp environments, indicating that oxygen levels were unusually high. High oxygen levels affected fires across ancient forests. Dry vegetation could catch fire more easily than it does under lower oxygen levels. Fires may have spread faster once they began. Even materials that usually resist burning could ignite when oxygen levels remained very high. After fires, forests often grew again. New plants covered burned ground, beginning another cycle of growth, death, burial, and oxygen production. Fires therefore became one part of the natural system that shaped Carboniferous ecosystems. Animals living during the Carboniferous period experienced conditions very different from those of today. High oxygen levels affected the way oxygen moved into their bodies. Many insects breathe through tiny openings called spiracles, connected to tubes that carry oxygen directly to their tissues. Higher oxygen levels allowed oxygen to move more efficiently through these tubes. Because oxygen reached body tissues more easily, some insects grew much larger than many insects living today. Giant dragonfly relatives, enormous millipedes, and large relatives of modern insects lived during this period. Their large size depended partly on the unusually rich oxygen supply. Large amphibians also lived in Carboniferous wetlands. These animals often depended on moist environments because many had skin that helped absorb oxygen as well as lungs. Rich oxygen supplies supported active ecosystems with many different kinds of animals. The earliest reptiles also appeared during the Carboniferous period. These animals developed eggs with protective coverings that allowed reproduction away from water. As forests expanded across broad landscapes, reptiles found new habitats where they could live and spread. The rich plant life supported many plant-eating animals. These animals became food for predators. High oxygen levels helped support active food webs containing many different species. Even though oxygen was abundant, life still faced many challenges. Seasonal flooding changed landscapes. Fires destroyed forests. Climate changes affected habitats. Competition for food and space continued among plants and animals. Disease, parasites, and environmental stress remained part of natural ecosystems. Scientists use computer models to estimate how atmospheric oxygen changed during Earth's history. These models combine information about plant growth, burial of organic matter, volcanic activity, erosion, weathering, ocean chemistry, and fossil evidence. Different models sometimes produce slightly different results, but many support the idea that oxygen reached its highest known levels during the late Carboniferous and early Permian. The rise in oxygen did not continue forever. Later changes in climate, plant communities, continental movement, and carbon cycling gradually lowered oxygen levels. As buried carbon became balanced by other natural processes, atmospheric oxygen slowly moved closer to modern values over millions of years. The carbon cycle explains much of this history. Carbon moves continuously between the atmosphere, oceans, rocks, living organisms, and soils. Plants remove carbon dioxide during photosynthesis. Animals return carbon dioxide through breathing. Dead organisms release carbon during decay. Volcanoes add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Rocks remove carbon dioxide through weathering. Sediments store carbon underground. These processes operate continuously over different lengths of time. During the Carboniferous period, one part of this cycle became especially important. Carbon burial increased greatly because huge amounts of dead plants accumulated in swamp forests. Since carbon remained locked underground for very long periods, oxygen accumulated in the atmosphere. Many of today's coal mines uncover rocks that formed during these ancient forests. Fossils preserved inside coal-bearing rocks include leaves, roots, trunks, spores, seeds, and impressions of bark. These fossils show how widespread Carboniferous forests once were. Scientists carefully study fossil spores because plants released countless spores into the air. Different plant species produced different kinds of spores. By examining these microscopic fossils, researchers identify which plants lived in ancient forests and how vegetation changed over time. Tree trunks preserved in place show that many forests remained standing until they became buried by sediments. Some fossil forests still contain upright trunks connected to ancient soil layers. These discoveries help scientists understand how quickly sediments covered living forests. Roots preserved beneath coal layers reveal how swamp plants grew in waterlogged ground. Thick root systems stabilized muddy soils and supported tall plants. When these plants died, their roots often remained buried beneath later deposits. Chemical studies of ancient rocks provide additional evidence for changing oxygen levels. Certain minerals form only under particular atmospheric conditions. Ratios of different chemical elements inside sediments help scientists estimate ancient environmental conditions. Isotopes of carbon preserved in rocks record changes in the carbon cycle. These chemical signatures reveal times when large amounts of carbon became buried. Since carbon burial is closely connected to oxygen production, isotope studies support the idea of rising oxygen during the Carboniferous period. Scientists also examine sulfur isotopes because sulfur moves through Earth's atmosphere, oceans, rocks, and living organisms. Changes in sulfur cycling provide additional clues about ancient oxygen levels and environmental conditions. Computer simulations allow researchers to test different ideas. They can change variables such as plant growth, volcanic activity, decay rates, burial of organic matter, and weathering. The results help scientists determine which combinations best explain evidence preserved in rocks. Not every part of the world experienced exactly the same conditions. Some regions were covered by dense forests, while others were drier or cooler. Oxygen mixed throughout the atmosphere, but local environments still differed because of climate, rainfall, elevation, and geography. Plants themselves changed over time. New species appeared while others disappeared. Different plant groups dominated forests at different times. These changes influenced how much carbon forests stored and how much oxygen they released. Large root systems increased soil formation by breaking rocks into smaller pieces. Organic matter mixed with minerals, creating fertile soils capable of supporting additional plant growth. Rich soils encouraged continued expansion of forests across suitable regions. Rivers carried fallen leaves, branches, and plant debris into lakes, swamps, and shallow seas. Some of this material became buried beneath mud before complete decay. Every buried layer represented additional carbon stored away from the atmosphere. Floods sometimes covered forests with thick layers of sediment. Trees died where they stood, but burial protected them from complete decay. Later forests often grew above these buried layers. Repeated flooding produced alternating layers of coal, sandstone, shale, and other sedimentary rocks. Ancient storms likely damaged forests by knocking down trees and breaking branches. Fallen wood collected in wetlands where water slowed decomposition. Over time, these deposits became part of future coal seams. The amount of sunlight reaching Earth also affected photosynthesis. Plants needed light, water, and carbon dioxide to grow. Favorable conditions allowed forests to produce enormous quantities of plant matter, year after year. The length of growing seasons influenced oxygen production. Tropical regions near the equator experience conditions suitable for plant growth during much of the year. Continuous growth increased the amount of oxygen released into the atmosphere. The atmosphere itself affected plant growth. Carbon dioxide served as the raw material for photosynthesis. As plants removed carbon dioxide, oxygen increased. Changes in carbon dioxide concentrations influenced how efficiently plants could grow under different environmental conditions. Water remained essential throughout this process. Swamps supplied moisture needed by giant plants. Wet conditions protected buried plant material from rapid decay. Rivers and rainfall maintained these swamp ecosystems across wide lowland regions. Life in freshwater environments also contributed to oxygen production. Aquatic plants and algae growing in ponds, lakes, rivers, and wetlands carried out photosynthesis. These organisms released oxygen into the water and indirectly supported the broader carbon cycle. Some oxygen dissolved into oceans, lakes, and rivers. Aquatic animals depended on dissolved oxygen just as land animals depended on atmospheric oxygen. Water temperature, movement, and biological activity affected oxygen concentrations in aquatic environments. Marine sediments preserved remains of countless tiny organisms. Over long periods, these sediments became sedimentary rocks, containing valuable information about ancient oceans and atmospheric conditions. The balance between oxygen production and oxygen consumption changed repeatedly throughout Earth's history. The Carboniferous Period represents one of the times when oxygen production greatly exceeded oxygen consumption, because so much carbon became trapped underground. This unusual balance lasted for millions of years, rather than only a short time. Continuous forest growth, repeated burial of plant material, widespread wetlands, and long-term geological processes all work together to maintain high oxygen levels. The evolution and rise of giant insects happened over a very long period during the Carboniferous Period, when life on land was becoming richer and more widespread than ever before. At that time, the land was covered with thick forests, wet swamps, shallow rivers, and large areas filled with tall plants. These natural conditions gave many small animals the food, water, and shelter they needed to survive and reproduce. Among these animals were the earliest insects. Over many generations, some groups of insects slowly became much larger than the insects living today. Insects had already existed for millions of years before they reached their greatest sizes. Their earliest ancestors were small creatures that lived among simple land plants and moist soil. They fed on tiny pieces of plant matter, fungi, algae, and other natural materials found on the ground. As plants spread across larger areas of land, insects also spread into new habitats. Each new generation carried small changes that helped them survive under different conditions. These gradual changes form the process known as evolution. Evolution does not happen all at once. Every generation is slightly different from the one before it. Some insects are born with features that help them find food more easily, avoid danger, or produce more young. Those insects often survive longer and leave more offspring. Over countless generations, useful features become more common. During the Carboniferous Period, this slow process allowed several groups of insects to become larger, while still remaining successful in their environments. The forests during this period were filled with giant club mosses, horsetails, seed ferns, and tree ferns. Many of these plants grew close together and formed thick vegetation across large parts of the land. Fallen leaves, branches, and dead plants collected on the wet ground because they broke down very slowly. The forests stayed damp for long periods, creating stable conditions for insects that needed moisture to survive. Many insects laid their eggs in wet places where young insects could grow safely. Food was available almost everywhere. Plant-eating insects fed on leaves, stems, spores, and soft plant tissues. Other insects fed on dead plants that covered the forest floor. Some hunted smaller insects, worms, or other tiny animals. Since there was so much plant life, many insects found enough food to support larger bodies. Healthy food supplies allowed insects to grow well and produce many offspring. One important reason giant insects appeared was the unusually high amount of oxygen in the atmosphere. Scientists believed that oxygen levels were much higher than they are today. Insects breathe through tiny openings called spiracles, which are found along the sides of their bodies. Air enters these openings and travels through a network of small tubes called tracheae. These tubes carry oxygen directly to the insect's tissues without the need for blood to transport oxygen in the same way it does in humans and many other animals. This breathing system works very well for small insects. As insects become larger, it becomes harder for oxygen to reach every part of the body through these tiny tubes. During the Carboniferous Period, the greater amount of oxygen in the air helped solve this problem. More oxygen entered the tracheae, allowing it to reach deeper tissues more easily. This made it possible for insects to grow much larger than they normally could under lower oxygen conditions. Scientists have studied fossils and ancient rocks to understand how oxygen levels changed through Earth's history. Chemical evidence found in rocks suggests that oxygen became unusually abundant during this period. Large forests removed huge amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere while producing oxygen through photosynthesis. Dead plant material often remained buried in wet swamps instead of breaking down completely. Over time, much of this buried plant matter became coal. Because large amounts of carbon stayed locked underground, oxygen remained in the atmosphere in greater amounts. The rise of giant insects did not happen in only one group. Several different insect groups developed larger body sizes. Some became giant, flying insects. Others grew into large crawling hunters. Different species followed different paths of evolution depending on their food sources, habitats, and ways of living. Among the best-known giant insects was Meganeura. This ancient insect looked similar to modern dragonflies, although it belonged to an ancient group that no longer exists. Meganeura had a wingspan that reached about 70 centimeters. Its long body, large eyes, and powerful wings made it one of the largest flying insects ever known. Meganeura spent much of its time flying above forests, rivers, ponds, and swamps. Its large eyes allowed it to notice movement from many directions. Sharp mouthparts helped it catch and eat prey. It hunted other insects while flying through the air. Fast flight allowed it to chase smaller animals that could not escape quickly enough. The wings of Meganeura were supported by a network of strong veins. These veins helped keep the wings stiff during flight while still allowing enough flexibility for movement. Large flight muscles inside the body powered the wings. The high oxygen levels helped these muscles receive enough oxygen to remain active during long flights. The young forms of insects related to Meganeura probably lived in freshwater habitats. Like modern dragonflies, they may have spent part of their lives underwater before becoming adults. Young insects living in ponds and slow-moving water hunted other small aquatic animals. As they grew larger, they shed their outer coverings several times before finally developing wings and leaving the water. Another famous giant insect was Meganeuropsis, which lived later than Meganeura but also reached enormous size. It had an even greater wingspan than Meganeura. Fossils show that it was among the largest insects ever to fly. Like its relatives, it hunted other insects using strong jaws and excellent eyesight. Not all giant insects were flyers. Arthropleura was a huge relative of today's millipedes. It could grow to more than 2 meters in length. Although it was not an insect in the strict scientific sense, it lived alongside giant insects during the same general period and shared many of the environmental conditions that allowed large land arthropods to exist. Arthropleura had a long body made up of many connected segments. Each segment carried pairs of legs that helped it move across the forest floor. Fossil footprints show that it walked through muddy ground and soft sediments. Scientists believe it fed mainly on dead plants, leaves, and other organic material lying on the ground. Large insects and other arthropods played important roles in ancient ecosystems. Plant-eating species helped control the growth of vegetation by feeding on leaves and stems. Hunters kept populations of smaller insects under control. Animals that fed on dead plants helped recycle nutrients by breaking down organic matter. Every species contributed to the movement of energy through the environment. Many insects developed special mouthparts suited to different kinds of food. Some had strong jaws for chewing leaves. Others had mouthparts designed for biting prey. These feeding structures slowly changed through evolution as insects adapted to different food sources. Natural selection favored individuals whose mouthparts worked well for the food available in their surroundings. The bodies of giant insects were protected by strong outer coverings, called exoskeletons. This hard covering supported the body, protected internal organs, and reduced water loss. As insects grew, they could not stretch their exoskeletons. Instead, they shed the old covering and produced a larger new one. This process is called molting. Molting was a risky time for giant insects. Immediately after shedding the old exoskeleton, the new one remained soft for a while. During this period, the insect was more vulnerable to attack because it could not defend itself as effectively. After some time, the new exoskeleton hardened, giving protection once again. The legs of giant insects were built for different purposes. Flying insects use their legs mainly for landing, climbing, and holding prey. Ground-dwelling insects developed stronger walking legs that allowed them to travel through thick plant growth and wet soil. Hunting species often had legs that helped them capture struggling prey. The eyes of giant insects were made of many tiny units called ommatidia. Each unit collected light from part of the surrounding environment. Together, these units formed a wide field of vision. This type of eye allowed flying hunters to detect movement quickly while searching for food. The nervous systems of insects also became better adapted over time. Their brains remained relatively small, but they efficiently processed information needed for movement, feeding, and reproduction. Nerve cords running along the body connected different segments and allowed rapid communication between body parts. Reproduction was essential for the continued success of giant insects. Adult males and females searched for mates during suitable seasons. After mating, females deposited eggs in safe places where young insects would have enough food after hatching. Some laid eggs in water, while others placed them on plants or in moist soil. Young insects often look different from adults. Many species pass through several stages of growth before reaching full size. Each stage allowed gradual development of wings, reproductive organs, and adult body structures. Repeated molting supported this steady growth. Climate also supported the success of giant insects. Large parts of the Carboniferous world remained warm and humid throughout much of the year. Moist air reduced the danger of drying out, which is especially important for insects because water easily escapes through parts of their bodies. Wet conditions allowed insects to stay active over wide areas. The absence of certain modern predators also helped some giant insects thrive. Many groups of birds had not yet evolved, because birds appeared much later in Earth's history. Flying reptiles had not yet entered the skies either. Without these later predators, giant flying insects occupied important positions in the air. Early amphibians hunted insects along rivers, ponds, and forest floors. As reptiles began to appear, some also fed on insects. Even so, giant insects remained successful because they had abundant habitats, plentiful food, and favorable environmental conditions. Competition existed among insects themselves. Different species often searched for similar food sources. Some became active during daylight, while others moved mainly during darker hours. Different feeding habits reduced direct competition and allowed many species to live in the same forests. The spread of forests created countless places where insects could hide. Thick leaves, fallen logs, tree bark, roots, and dense plant stems offered protection from predators. Moist ground also helped preserve eggs and supported the growth of young insects. Many insects depended closely on water. Streams, ponds, marshes, and swamps provided breeding places for aquatic young. Water also supported many other animals that served as food for insect hunters. Seasonal flooding sometimes created new habitats, while removing old ones, forcing insects to spread into different areas. The fossil record gives scientists important evidence about giant insects. Fossils include complete bodies, wings, footprints, eggs, and feeding marks left on ancient plants. Some fossils preserve tiny details such as wing veins, mouthparts, and body hairs. These details allow scientists to study the appearance and lifestyles of extinct species. Most insect fossils formed when dead insects quickly became buried under mud, fine sand, or volcanic ash. Burial protected the bodies from scavengers and weathering. Over long periods, minerals replaced organic materials or filled empty spaces, preserving detailed shapes within the rocks. Some fossils preserve only impressions rather than complete bodies. Even these impressions provide valuable information. The size of wings, arrangement of veins, body proportions, and leg structures can often be studied from these remains. Scientists also study trace fossils. These include footprints, burrows, feeding marks, and resting impressions. Trace fossils reveal behavior rather than body structure. They help scientists understand how giant insects moved, hunted, rested, and interacted with their environments. Plant fossils often show evidence of insect feeding. Leaves contain holes, bite marks, tunnels, and damaged edges that match insect activity. These signs reveal that insects and plants had already developed close ecological relationships. Plants evolved defenses, while insects evolved ways to continue feeding despite those defenses. Evolution continued throughout the Carboniferous Period. New species appeared while others disappeared. Environmental changes affected which insects survived. Populations living in different regions slowly developed their own characteristics. Over many generations, these differences became great enough to form entirely new species. The movement of continents also influenced insect evolution. Large land areas connected many forests, allowing insects to spread across wide regions. At other times, changing landscapes separated populations. Once separated groups followed different evolutionary paths because they experienced different climates, food supplies, and environmental pressures. Volcanic activity, mountain building, changing sea levels, and shifting rivers continually altered habitats. Some forests disappeared while new ones formed elsewhere. Insects that could adapt to changing conditions survived more successfully than those with narrow environmental needs. The Carboniferous period eventually came to an end. Climate patterns slowly changed. Some regions became drier than before. Swamp forests shrank in many places. Oxygen levels gradually declined from their earlier high values. These changes affected giant insects in several ways. Lower oxygen levels reduced the advantage that had supported very large insect bodies. The tracheal breathing system became less effective for extremely large insects under reduced oxygen conditions. Smaller body sizes became more practical as environmental conditions changed. New predators also appeared during later periods. Reptiles continued to diversify, and much later, the evolution of birds and flying reptiles increased the dangers faced by large flying insects. Different forms of competition and predation changed the balance within ecosystems. Many giant insect groups eventually became extinct. Extinction does not always happen suddenly. Populations may slowly decline over many generations as habitats disappear, food becomes scarce, reproduction decreases, and environmental pressures increase. Eventually, the last members of a species die without leaving descendants. Although the giant insects disappeared, insects themselves remained highly successful. Smaller species continued evolving into the enormous variety seen today. Modern insects include beetles, butterflies, moths, dragonflies, ants, bees, wasps, flies, grasshoppers, crickets, termites, and countless other groups. Each carries inherited features shaped by millions of years of evolution. Modern dragonflies still provide clues about their ancient relatives. Their flying skills, large compound eyes, aquatic young and hunting behavior show many characteristics that have existed for a very long time. Although today's dragonflies are much smaller than Meganeura, they preserve many ancient features. The daily climate during the Carboniferous period was shaped by very warm conditions, high moisture in many regions, and a natural cycle of heavy rainfall that supported vast forests and large wetlands. The land looked very different from today, and the movement of air, water, and heat created weather patterns that remained active throughout the year. Many areas received large amounts of rain, while some parts of the world experienced drier conditions depending on their location. The daily weather influenced the growth of plants, the flow of rivers, the spread of swamps, and the lives of the animals that lived in these ancient environments. Warm air rising from large bodies of water carried huge amounts of moisture into the atmosphere. As this warm and wet air moved across the land, it cooled and formed thick clouds. These clouds often released rain over forests, river valleys, and low-lying plains. Rainfall was common in many regions, especially near the equator, where temperatures remained high for much of the year. Some places experienced rain almost every day, while other areas had periods of sunshine, followed by sudden storms. The forests depended on this steady supply of water. Giant club mosses, horsetails, seed ferns and tree ferns absorbed water from the wet soil. Their roots spread through soft ground that remained damp for long periods. Rainwater filled shallow pools and streams that carried fresh water through the forests. Fallen leaves and broken branches collected on the wet ground, where they slowly became part of thick layers of plant material. Storm clouds often formed during the warmest part of the day. As the sun heated the ground, warm air rose into the sky. The rising air carried water vapor upward, where it cooled and formed clouds. These clouds became larger and darker as more moisture gathered inside them. Heavy rain then fell across wide areas, soaking the forests and filling rivers with fresh water. Some storms included powerful winds. Strong gusts bent the tall trees and broke weak branches. Dead trunks sometimes fell into nearby swamps or rivers, where they became buried under mud and plant remains. Lightning also appeared during many storms. Lightning strikes could damage trees, although wet conditions reduced the spread of large fires in many swamp regions. Flooding was a common part of life in many Carboniferous landscapes. Rivers collected rainwater from higher ground and carried it across broad plains. During periods of heavy rainfall, rivers overflowed their banks. Water spread across nearby forests and swamps, covering large areas with muddy water. These floods left behind fresh layers of silt and clay after the water slowly moved away. Floodwaters brought important materials that helped plants grow. Mud carried minerals from distant hills and deposited them across floodplains. Fresh soil covered old ground, giving new plants a place to grow. Seeds and spores also travelled with moving water, allowing plants to spread into new areas after floods ended. Flooding changed the shape of rivers over time. Fast-moving water cut into riverbanks, while slower water dropped sand and mud in other places. River channels shifted from one location to another over many years. Old channels filled with mud, while new streams formed nearby. This constant movement created many different habitats for plants and animals. Swamps expanded during wet periods when rainfall remained high. Water stood across broad areas, forming shallow pools connected by slow-moving streams. The ground beneath the water became soft and low in oxygen. Dead plants broke down very slowly because many tiny organisms could not survive well without enough oxygen. As more plant material collected year after year, thick layers formed that later became peat. The amount of rain often changed with the seasons. Some times of the year brought almost daily rainfall, while other times had shorter dry periods. Even during drier months, many swamps remained wet because the ground held large amounts of water. Rivers, lakes, and underground water also helped keep the forests alive during times with less rain. Seasonal changes were influenced by the position of the continents and the movement of the Earth around the Sun. Areas close to the equator usually remained warm throughout the year. Temperature changes between seasons were often small compared with many places today. Instead of large differences in heat, many regions experienced changes, mainly in the amount of rainfall they received. In southern parts of the ancient world, large ice sheets covered parts of the land during certain times. These glaciers influenced sea levels and affected weather patterns across distant regions. When more water became locked inside ice, sea levels dropped. When the ice melted, sea levels rose again. Rising seas sometimes flooded coastal forests, while falling seas exposed new land where plants could spread. Coastal regions experienced weather influenced by nearby oceans. Sea breezes carried moist air inland during the day. At night, cooler air moved back toward the sea. These daily movements helped create clouds and rainfall along coastlines. Salt water mixed with fresh water in some low coastal swamps, creating environments where special kinds of plants and animals could live. Humidity remained very high across many forest regions. The air often contained large amounts of water vapor. Morning fog sometimes formed above rivers, lakes, and swamps as cooler night air met warm water. As the sun rose higher, the fog slowly disappeared, leaving warm and moist conditions through much of the day. Cloud cover changed from day to day. Some mornings began with clear skies before clouds slowly developed during the afternoon. Other days remained cloudy from sunrise until sunset. Thick clouds reduced the amount of sunlight reaching the forest floor, creating cooler and darker conditions beneath the tall trees. Wind patterns helped move moisture across the continents. Large air currents carried warm, wet air from tropical seas toward inland forests. Other winds carried cooler air from higher latitudes into some regions. Where different air masses met, storms often became stronger and produced very heavy rainfall. Mountain ranges also affected weather. As moist air moved toward mountains, it rose higher into the atmosphere. Rising air cooled, causing water vapor to become rain. The side of the mountains facing the wind often received much more rainfall than the opposite side. Rivers flowing from these mountains carried fresh water into valleys and swamp forests below. Different parts of the Carboniferous world experienced different weather conditions. Equatorial forests remained wet and warm for long periods. Some inland regions had alternating wet and dry seasons. Areas farther from large bodies of water sometimes received less rainfall because much of the moisture had already fallen before the air reached them. Weather affected every living thing. Amphibians laid eggs in ponds, streams, and flooded wetlands where young animals could grow safely. Fish populations increased when rivers overflowed into floodplains, creating new pools rich in food. Insects found shelter among dense plants that stayed green because of regular rainfall. Many animals timed their feeding and breeding around the availability of water. Plants also responded to changes in weather. During wetter periods, they produced large numbers of spores that spread through the air and water. Moist conditions helped these spores grow into new plants after reaching suitable ground. During drier times, growth slowed in some places until rainfall returned. Rainfall influenced the amount of fresh water entering lakes and rivers. High rainfall increased river flow and raised water levels. Lower rainfall reduced the speed of rivers and exposed muddy banks. These changing water levels affected where plants rooted and where animals searched for food. The daily cycle of sunlight and darkness also influenced climate conditions. Warm afternoons encouraged cloud formation and rainfall, while cooler nights allowed moisture to collect as dew on leaves and stems. This extra moisture provided another source of water for many small plants, growing close to the ground. Over many thousands of years, repeated cycles of rainfall, flooding, and changing seasons shaped the landscape. Thick forests continued to grow because water remained plentiful across large regions. Rivers carved new paths, swamps expanded and contracted, and layers of plant material accumulated beneath standing water. These natural weather patterns supported one of the richest plant environments in Earth's history and created the conditions that allowed enormous amounts of organic material to gather beneath the surface.